My name is Claire Hensley, and for most of my adult life, my parents had a special way of making me feel like an unfinished sentence. Not a failure exactly. They were too polite for that word. Too church-going. Too careful about how things sounded in public. They called me independent when they meant difficult. They called me private when they meant disappointing. And when they didn't know how to explain me to their friends, they simply smiled and changed the subject. That Saturday night, my father's retirement dinner was held at Belmead Country Club, in a room with polished floors, white tablecloths, and chandeliers bright enough to make every lie look expensive. My father, Warren Hensley, was retiring after 41 years in the restaurant business, and 80 people had come to celebrate him like he had built Nashville with his bare hands. My brother Evan sat near the center table with his perfect wife, Tessa, both of them glowing under my parents' pride. My mother, Patrice, floated from guest to guest in a pearl necklace, telling everyone how blessed she was. I stood near the edge of the room, rubbing my right knee through the fabric of my dress, trying not to limp. Then my father lifted his glass. "At least both my children made it tonight," he said, smiling toward the room. Evan came straight from a board meeting. Claire came from... He paused, pretending to search for the word. "Well, whatever Claire does these days." Soft laughter moved through the tables. Then he looked right at me. "Claire, be honest. Can you even cook?" My mother laughed first. Evan followed. Tessa covered her mouth like that made it kinder. I set my water glass down. "Only if it's easier than keeping a medevac bird steady over Helmand and crosswinds." The room laughed harder. Everyone except the old man at the end of the table. General Malcolm Reeve stopped with his glass halfway to his mouth, stared at me, and said quietly, "Chief Warrant Officer Hensley?" For a second, nobody moved. Forks stayed in the air. Smiles froze where they were. My father's hand tightened around the stem of his wineglass, and my mother blinked like she had just heard a foreign language spoken at her own table. That was the thing about my family. They were excellent at hearing what confirmed the story they liked. Anything else passed through the room like static. I grew up less than 10 minutes from Belmead, close enough to see the stone gates from the back seat of my father's old Cadillac, but far enough to understand they were not meant for people like us yet. Warren Hensley spent his whole life trying to cross that distance. He started with one breakfast diner near Murfreesboro, then bought a second location, then a third, until people began calling him a restaurant man instead of a man who owned restaurants. My mother treated that difference like a promotion from God. In our house, presentation mattered. Shoes by the door were lazy. Wrinkles meant disrespect. Showing up late meant you had announced to the world that your family had not raised you properly. Evan understood the rules early. He wore button-down shirts without being told. He shook hands firmly. He learned to talk about profit margins before he could legally drink. My father saw himself in him, only cleaner, taller, more polished. I was harder for them to package. I liked machines. Not in the cute way, not the help your father change a tire way. People could turn into a charming story at dinner. I liked the logic of them. The honesty, engines either worked or they didn't. Weather either cleared or it didn't. A rotor system did not care how good your family looked in a Christmas photo. When Evan got into college, my parents rented a tent, hired a caterer, and invited half the church. When I enlisted in the Army National Guard, my mother sat very still at the kitchen table and asked whether I was doing it because I was angry at them. My father drove me to the recruiting office without speaking much. Before I got out, he said, "Just don't make this your whole personality." Years later, when I became a pilot, they told people I worked around helicopters, around them, as if I dusted them, as if I filed paperwork beside them. The word pilot never seemed to survive my mother's mouth. So when General Reeve said my old rank in that bright country club dining room, the shock on my parents' faces did not surprise me. What surprised me was how much it still hurt. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. It hurt because I had spent years pretending those little erasures were accidents. Nobody in my family ever dragged my uniform to the curb or told me outright that they were ashamed of me. That would have been too obvious, and obvious cruelty was not my parents' style. They preferred clean hands, quiet edits. A photograph moved from the mantel to a side table, then from the side table to a drawer, then from the drawer to a box nobody opened. The first time I noticed it was after flight training. I had mailed home a picture from Fort Rucker, standing beside a training aircraft with my helmet tucked under my arm, and the kind of grin you only wear when you have survived something harder than you expected. I came home for Christmas 6 months later, and found that photo under a stack of warranty papers in the kitchen drawer. My mother said she had been meaning to frame it. She sounded so sincere that I almost believed her. After my first deployment, I brought back a challenge coin and a crew photo taken in dust, so thick the horizon had disappeared. My father held the photo for maybe 3 seconds, before asking whether all that flying would make it harder for me to settle into normal work. Normal work. As if the point of everything I had done was to return home and become easier to explain. At Thanksgiving one year, my mother asked me to take off my boots before guests arrived. They were clean. I had polished them that morning. Still, she said they made the entryway look harsh. I carried them upstairs and placed them in my old bedroom, beside a shelf that still held Evan's high school plaques in perfect rows. That was how it went. Evan's achievements stayed visible. Mine became something to manage. His first business license hung in my father's office. His newspaper mention was laminated and passed around after church. When his company sponsored a charity golf tournament, my mother posted pictures before the event had even ended. But when someone asked about my service, she smiled and said I didn't like to discuss that difficult period. For a long time, I helped them. That is the part I hate admitting. I stopped correcting introductions. I stopped bringing photos home. I stopped explaining that I had not worked around helicopters. I had flown them. It was easier to let my life become a foggy chapter everyone could step around. So when General Reeve said my old rank in that dining room, he did more than recognize me. He reached into every drawer, every box, every polite silence, and pulled the real version of me back into the light. But before that night could mean anything, you have to understand what my life looked like by then, because it was not the kind of life my parents knew how to respect. I was no longer wearing a uniform. I was not crossing flight lines before sunrise, checking weather reports with a headset around my neck, or climbing into a cockpit while a crew waited for my voice. Most mornings, I drove 22 minutes to Cumberland Valley Community College with coffee in a travel mug and lesson plans stuffed into a canvas bag with a broken zipper I kept promising myself I would replace. I taught aviation maintenance fundamentals, hydraulics, rotor systems, safety procedures, the kind of subjects nobody brags about at charity dinners, but the kind that keep aircraft from falling out of the sky. My students were not polished in the way my parents admired. They were single mothers starting over, veterans trying to turn old skills into civilian paychecks, 19-year-olds who had been told they were not college material, and men in their 50s who had lost jobs and were trying not to lose themselves. I understood them better than I ever understood the people at my parents' table. I loved that job. My parents heard community college and treated it like a temporary inconvenience. "Is that full-time?" my mother asked once, stirring sugar into her tea. "Or just something you're doing until you find something more permanent?" I remember looking at her hands. Perfect nails. Wedding ring turned toward the light. She asked it gently, which almost made it worse. To Warren, a respectable career came with a corner office, a company logo, and men who lowered their voices when you entered the room. To Patrice, success had to fit into one clean sentence at a church luncheon. Evan owned part of a real estate consulting firm. That was easy to explain. Claire taught engine diagrams to students with grease under their fingernails. That required too much patience from the listener. After my medical separation, recovery changed the way I moved and the way my clothes fit, slowly enough that I kept pretending not to notice. Stairs became negotiations, Rain arrived early in my knee. I was 44, divorced, childless, and living in a modest townhouse outside Nashville with a porch light that flickered whenever storms rolled in. In my mother's world, that combination sounded like something to pray over. She never said it directly. She just touched my arm and said, "You still have time to build a full life, sweetheart," as if the one I had was a rough draft. My father was worse because he made it sound practical. "You're smart, Claire," he told me once. "You just never learned how to turn smart into something people recognize." What he meant was money. What he meant was status. What he meant was Evan. And over time, my ordinary life became their favorite evidence against me. That was why my father's retirement dinner felt less like a celebration and more like a story my family had rehearsed until every rough edge was hidden. Belmead Country Club was exactly the kind of place Warren Hensley had spent his life trying to enter without looking grateful. The dining room overlooked a lawn so carefully trimmed it seemed unreal, like even the grass had signed an agreement to behave. Waiters moved between tables with trays of wine and plated salmon, silent enough to make wealth feel natural. My mother had chosen cream centerpieces because bright flowers, she said, pulled focus from the family. She said things like that without hearing herself. There were 82 guests, though my mother kept calling it a small gathering. Former business partners, church friends, a city councilman, 2 donors Evan wanted to impress. Reverend Pike near the front, smiling with the careful approval he gave families who looked good from a distance. Evan and Tessa were placed at the center table, where everyone could see them. I was seated closer to the end, between a retired dentist and a woman who asked whether I taught real college or the other kind. I told her aviation maintenance. She said, "How interesting," in a voice that meant she would not be asking a follow-up question. The speeches began after the salad plates were cleared. One man talked about my father's first diner and how Warren had opened at 5 every morning for 11 straight years. Another praised his generosity. Evan stood next, smooth and bright under the chandelier, telling a story about sweeping floors as a teenager and learning that leadership meant never asking someone to do a job you would not do yourself. It was a good line. My father loved good lines. Then the slideshow started. Warren in 1997, cutting a ribbon. Warren shaking hands with the mayor. Evan in a graduation gown. Evan beside a sold sign. Evan and Tessa at a fundraiser. Patrice at the church food pantry, one hand placed gently on a canned goods box like she had invented charity. The Hensleys at Christmas. The Hensleys at Easter. The Hensleys smiling in front of restaurants, churches, golf courses, and fireplaces. I appeared once, near the end, carrying a tray of lemonade at a backyard barbecue. No uniform, no aircraft, no flight school, no service photo accidentally placed where someone might ask a real question. People clapped anyway. By dessert, my knee was throbbing beneath the table, and I was thinking about leaving quietly before coffee. Then my father rose for his final toast, flushed from wine and admiration, and turned toward me with that soft public cruelty he had always mistaken for charm. "And Claire," he said, smiling wider, "took the scenic route through life." A few people chuckled. Tessa leaned toward the woman beside her and murmured, "Some people do need extra time." My father lifted his glass. "Since she never joined the family business, maybe tonight she can finally settle one mystery for us. Claire, can you even cook?" The laughter came too quickly. And at the far end of the table, General Malcolm Reeve lowered his glass without taking a sip. I answered before I could soften myself for the room. "Only if it's easier than holding a medevac bird steady over Helmand in crosswinds." At first, people laughed because they thought I had delivered the kind of strange, harmless comeback women are allowed to make when men embarrass them in public. Then the sound thinned. It did not stop all at once. It faded table by table, like people slowly realizing they had clapped at the wrong part of a speech. General Malcolm Reeve turned fully toward me. "Chief Warrant Officer Hensley?" The title cut through the room more sharply than any shout could have. Silverware paused. My father's smile tightened. My mother's hand moved to her necklace, thumb finding the pearls the way it always did, when she needed a second to rearrange reality. I looked at the general and said, "Not anymore, sir." That was all. 4 words. But they changed the air. My father recovered first. Warren Hensley had built a career on never letting a room see him lose control, so he gave a short laugh and lifted his hand. Like the whole thing was a misunderstanding he could smooth flat. "Well," he said, "Claire had an interesting season in the service. We don't usually make a big production out of it." An interesting season. General Reeve's face did not move much, but something in his eyes closed. My mother leaned toward the woman beside her with a bright, careful smile. "She's always been very private about those years. We've tried to respect that." That almost made me laugh. Patrice could turn neglect into manners without spilling a drop of wine. Across the table, Evan frowned. "You actually know him? Not, you knew a general? Not, why didn't I know this? Just suspicion, as if I had wandered into a room where I did not belong, and somehow fooled the doorman." Tessa touched his sleeve and murmured, "Maybe he has her confused with someone else." She meant it to be quiet. It was not. The rest of dinner dragged forward on polished manners and nervous coffee. My father made one more joke, smaller than before. My mother praised the dessert. Guests glanced at me, then looked away. Nobody asked about Helmand. Nobody asked what I had flown. Nobody asked why a 3-star general had remembered my name after 12 years. When I stepped outside, the night air felt cooler than the room deserved. I was halfway to the valet stand when I heard Claire. General Reeve stood near the stone entrance, coat folded over one arm. Up close, he looked older than the man in my memory, but his eyes were exactly the same. He handed me a cream envelope. Inside was an invitation from the Veterans Air Rescue Foundation. On the back, written in blue ink, was one sentence: "It is time they heard about Helmand, 2012. I did not open the envelope again until after midnight. I placed it on my kitchen table like it might move if I looked away too long. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and the soft tick of the wall clock above the stove. Rain tapped against the windows, light and steady, the kind of rain that made my knee ache before the weather app admitted anything was coming. For almost an hour, I just sat there. Then I read the invitation again. Veterans Air Rescue Foundation, Annual Recognition Dinner. Tennessee Museum of Aviation. Honoring service members connected to recently reviewed medical evacuation missions. Beneath the formal language was my name, printed so clearly it felt almost rude. Chief Warrant Officer Claire Hensley. I had spent years letting that name belong to another life. Seeing it on thick cream paper made my hands feel cold. 3 days later, the foundation called while I was in my classroom, standing beside a whiteboard half covered in hydraulic system diagrams. My students had just left for lunch. The room smelled faintly of dry erase marker and machine oil from the lab down the hall. "Miss Hensley?" a woman asked. "This is Claire. My name is Lydia Marr, with the Veterans Air Rescue Foundation. I'm calling to confirm your attendance as the primary honoree for the Helmand 2012 recognition segment." The words did not shock me. That was the strange part. They confirmed something I had already felt moving toward me since General Reeve lowered his glass. Still, I had to sit down. "I'm sorry," I said. "Could you say that again?" She did. Then she sent the email. I opened it on the classroom computer because my phone screen felt too small for something that large. There was the event schedule, the guest list, the draft program, and attached at the bottom, a short public summary from the reviewed mission file. Nothing classified, nothing dramatic, just enough truth to make the past official. My eyes stopped on one line. For extraordinary courage during a medical evacuation under severe weather and deteriorating ground conditions, Helmand Province, 2012. The classroom blurred a little. I remembered the color of the sky that day, not blue, not gray, but a hard pale brown that seemed to swallow distance. I remembered radio voices stepping over each other. I remembered my crew chief's hand signals. I remembered the weight of making a decision with no clean option. Mostly, I remembered coming home and trying to tell my mother one small piece of it. She had touched my arm and said, "Maybe don't dwell on that, honey." So I had stopped dwelling out loud. But now the truth had an email header, a schedule, a foundation seal, and a room full of people preparing to hear it. For the first time, it was not just memory. It was evidence. Evidence should have made me feel safer. Instead, it made me feel exposed. For 3 days, I carried that email around like a second pulse. I opened it between classes, then closed it before anyone could walk past my desk. I printed the program once, stared at it, then slid it into a folder under attendance sheets and quiz rubrics, as if hiding it beneath ordinary paperwork could make it less real. General Reeve called the following Monday. "There's a diner near Smyrna Airport," he said. "Do you still take your coffee black?" I had not expected him to remember that. "Only when I'm trying to prove a point," I said. "Then I'll order it black." The diner sat beside a 2-lane road lined with chain-link fences and low hangars, the kind of place where the windows rattled when small aircraft passed overhead. Inside, the booths were cracked vinyl, the coffee was bitter, and the waitress called everyone baby, whether they were 20 or 80. I liked it immediately. General Reeve was already there when I arrived, because of course he was. He sat in the back booth with a leather folder beside his coffee cup and a newspaper folded with military precision. "Claire," he said. "Not chief, not warrant officer, just Claire." Somehow that helped. I slid into the booth across from him. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this." He did not ask what I meant. He tapped the folder once. "You don't have to do anything dramatic. That would be a first for my family." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. Then he opened the folder and turned a few pages toward me. Public release summary. Event schedule. Names of 3 other service members being recognized. A letter from one of the medics who had been on the ground that day. I touched the edge of it but did not pick it up. "I'm not trying to punish them," I said. "I know. I'm angry enough to want to." "That's different." I looked up. General Reeve stirred his coffee, though he had added nothing to it. "Anger is information. Revenge is a career. Don't confuse the two." The sentence sat between us longer than either of us expected. He leaned back. "Tell the truth. Keep it clean. Let your parents decide what kind of people they were when they refused to hear it." Outside, a small plane lifted into the cloudy afternoon, its engine buzzing thinly through the glass. I watched it climb until it disappeared behind the diner sign. "What if I freeze?" I asked. "Then freeze honestly," he said. "People respect honest more than polished." For the first time since that dinner, I breathed all the way in. The problem was that truth does not travel alone. Once it starts moving, people who ignored it for years suddenly want to stand beside it in photographs. My father found out about the recognition dinner from Reverend Pike. Of all people, the foundation had sent invitations to several local leaders and clergy who worked with veteran outreach, and apparently the Reverend mentioned it after Sunday service, with the pleased surprise of a man who had discovered a respectable secret. Warren called me that afternoon. "Well," he said, in the tone he used when trying to sound casual and important at the same time, "I hear there's some kind of aviation event coming up." I was standing in the grocery store aisle, comparing 2 brands of coffee I did not care about. "There is. You might have told us." I almost smiled. "I wasn't aware you were interested." Silence moved through the phone. "Not long, but enough." "Claire," he said firmer now, "if this involves the family name, your mother and I should be there." The family name. Not my name. That distinction arrived clean and sharp. By Monday morning, Patrice had texted me 3 dress options, none of which I had asked for. One was navy, one was cream, and one looked like something a senator's wife would wear while pretending to enjoy a fundraiser. She added, "You'll want to look soft, but dignified." I stared at the word soft for a long time before deleting the message. Evan called next. He wanted to know whether his firm could sponsor a table. "It would look good," he said, then caught himself and added, "I mean, it's a great cause." Tessa was even faster. She had already found the foundation's social media page and suggested we take a proper family photo before the ceremony. She used the phrase full circle, as if my military service had been a decorative ribbon tied neatly around my father's retirement story. Nobody asked what happened in Helmand. Not once. My mother asked whether there would be press. My father asked where the donors were seated. Evan asked whether General Reeve knew any state officials. Tessa wanted to know if the museum lighting was good for pictures. They circled the event like people smelling smoke and hoping it came from a barbecue. I could have stopped them. I could have told them not to come, not to buy a table, not to turn my life into another Hensley performance. But I heard General Reeve's voice in that diner. Let them decide what kind of people they were when they refused to hear it. So I did not warn them. For once, I let my family walk toward the truth wearing their best clothes. They almost made it to the ceremony without understanding what they were walking into. The night before the event, I stayed late at the college to finish grading practical exams. The lab was empty, except for the low buzz of fluorescent lights and the smell of metal, rubber, and old coffee. On one workbench, a student had left a half-assembled fuel pump with every screw lined up in careful order. That small evidence of effort steadied me more than I expected. My phone rang at 7:18. Dad. I let it ring 3 times before answering. For a moment, there was only breathing on the other end. Then my father said, Claire, not sweetheart, not kiddo, not any of the easy names he used when he wanted control without intimacy. Just my name, flat and unfamiliar in his mouth. Yes? I just received the program. I closed my gradebook slowly. The foundation had sent the final version to sponsors and invited guests that evening. I could picture him in his home office, standing behind the big mahogany desk he bought when Evan closed his first major deal. I could picture the framed family photos behind him. I could picture him scrolling until he reached the page that made the room tilt. Guest of honor, Chief Warrant Officer Claire Hensley. Beneath it, the line he could not smooth over with a joke. Recognized for extraordinary courage during a medical evacuation mission in Helmand Province, 2012. His voice came back smaller. Why didn't you tell us it was this serious? I looked across the lab at the diagrams pinned to the wall, at arrows showing pressure, resistance, flow. Machines made sense because they did not pretend a blockage was love. I did tell you, I said, years ago. No, Claire. You said things were difficult. I said more than that. He did not answer. I remembered sitting in my parents' kitchen after I came home, trying to explain dust so thick it erased distance, trying to explain why loud noises made my shoulders tighten, trying to tell my mother that some days my body arrived home before the rest of me did. She had nodded, then asked if I wanted chicken salad. My father cleared his throat. Tomorrow is important. Yes, I said. It is, for all of us. There it was. I almost felt tired enough to laugh. After we hung up, my mother called. Her voice was soft and trembling in that practiced way that always made her sound like the injured party. Please don't make this uncomfortable tomorrow, she said. I stood alone in the lab, surrounded by parts built to withstand pressure. Mom, I said, I'm not the one who made my life uncomfortable to talk about. She started to cry then, quietly. This time, I did not apologize. The next evening, I drove to the Tennessee Museum of Aviation, with both hands on the steering wheel and the strange calm of someone who had already survived the worst part in private. The museum glowed against the early dusk, all glass, steel, and polished wings behind tall windows. Volunteers in navy blazers guided guests toward the main hall, where round tables had been set between aircraft displays. American flags stood near the stage. A local news crew adjusted lights near the back wall. Veterans greeted one another with handshakes that turned into brief, hard hugs. Families moved carefully around them, as if they understood they were standing inside memories they had not earned. I saw my family before they saw me. My father wore his best suit. My mother had chosen the navy dress she once suggested for me. Evan stood beside Tessa near their sponsored table, both of them smiling too widely at people whose names they were trying to remember. When Warren finally spotted me, he lifted one hand, not quite a wave, more like a signal that I should come stand where the family looked complete. I did not move. General Reeve found me near a suspended training aircraft. Ready? No. Good, he said. That means you know it matters. The program began without drama. A chaplain gave a short blessing. 2 service members were recognized for rescue work after hurricanes. A nurse received a standing ovation from people who understood the word service did not always come with rank. Then General Reeve stepped to the podium, and the room settled in a way I could feel in my ribs. He spoke plainly. No music under the story. No polished hero language. Just Helmand, 2012. A medical team pinned down by weather and failing communication. A landing zone that should have been impossible. A crew making calculations faster than fear could finish a sentence. He never made it sound pretty. That was why it landed. There are moments, he said, when courage is not loud. Sometimes it is a pilot's voice staying steady while everything around her tells her to turn back. My eyes dropped to my hands. Then he said my name. Chief Warrant Officer Claire Hensley. The room rose before I fully stood. Chairs scraped back. Applause filled the hall, not wild, not theatrical, but deep enough to make breathing difficult. I walked to the stage through a sound I had never expected to hear for myself. When I reached the podium, I looked once toward my family. My father's face had gone pale. My mother was crying silently. Evan stared at the table. Tessa's phone was lowered in her lap. I accepted the plaque and leaned toward the microphone. I was not alone that day, I said. No one ever is. Then I thanked the crew chiefs, the medics, the mechanics, the radio operators, and the families who carried the parts of service no uniform could show. I never mentioned my parents. The truth already had. After the applause, the room did what rooms always do after truth enters them. It rearranged itself. People came toward me in small waves. Veterans first, because they knew how to say less and mean more. A retired medic squeezed my hand and simply nodded. One of the hurricane rescue pilots told me he had used a training method I had written for my students. Then Dr. Naomi Bell appeared near the edge of the crowd, smiling like she had been waiting years for me to stand somewhere visible. You know, she said, the State Aviation Board called me this morning. They want to talk about your program. For a second, I thought she meant the ceremony. Then I realized she meant my students, my classroom, my ordinary, overlooked work. Before I could answer, a young man in a mechanic's jacket stepped forward, holding his cap in both hands. Miss Hensley? He said. It took me a moment. Miles? Miles Donnelly looked older than 24, and younger than the life he had already survived. He had been one of mine, a kid who nearly dropped out twice, who once told me nobody in his family expected him to finish anything. Now his name patch was stitched over his heart. You're the reason I didn't quit, he said. That was the moment I almost cried. Not on stage. Not when General Reeve said my name. But there, beside a museum aircraft, looking at proof that my life had kept mattering even after my family stopped measuring it. My father waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. My mother stood beside him, eyes red, one hand pressed to her pearls. Evan and Tessa hovered behind them. Careful now. Quiet now. Warren opened his arms like a camera might appear any second. Claire, he said, voice thick. Your mother and I always knew you were special. I stepped back before he could hug me. No, I said softly. You knew when it became useful to say so. His face changed. Not anger exactly. Something closer to exposure. My mother whispered. Can't we just move forward? We can, I said. But not by pretending backward. Didn't happen. No one spoke. So, I told them the rules. No more jokes at my expense. No more calling my service a phase. No more using my name when it brings you pride, and hiding it when it makes you uncomfortable. If they wanted a place in my life, they could start by telling the truth in rooms where I was not present to defend myself. Weeks later, I was back at Cumberland Valley, teaching rotor dynamics to students who cared more about torque than speeches. My knee still warned me before rain. My porch light still flickered. My life did not become glamorous overnight. It became mine again. I hung one photograph on my office wall. Me in a flight suit, dust on my face, standing beside a medevac helicopter under a pale brown sky. For years, my parents had asked if I could even cook, as if usefulness was the highest thing a daughter could become. But that night, when a 3-star general said my name, I remembered something they had tried to bury. I was never small. I had only spent too long in rooms too small for the truth. The lesson I carry from Claire's story is this: sometimes the people closest to us are the last ones willing to see who we really are. Not because the truth is hidden. Sometimes it is sitting right in front of them, in old photographs, quiet sacrifices, tired eyes, and years of work they never bothered to understand. But if your truth does not fit the role they assigned you, they may shrink it, rename it, or tuck it away until even you begin to wonder if it mattered. That is why we have to be careful about the rooms we keep returning to. Some rooms celebrate us, some rooms tolerate us, and some rooms only have space for the version of us that makes other people comfortable. Family should be the place where your story is held with care, but blood alone does not give anyone the right to rewrite your life. Love is not supposed to make you smaller. Love is not supposed to laugh while you are being humiliated. Love does not hide your strength, then claim pride when the world finally applauds it. Claire's real victory was not the award. It was not the standing ovation. It was not watching her parents realize how wrong they had been. Her real victory was quieter than that. She stopped asking people who ignored her pain to validate her worth. She stopped making herself easy to explain. She stopped letting other people's discomfort decide how much of herself she was allowed to show. And that is a kind of freedom many people spend their whole lives trying to find. Maybe you have been the overlooked one, the child who did not fit the family picture, the sibling whose achievements were treated like side notes, the person who kept showing up, even when no one clapped. If so, remember this: being unseen does not mean being unworthy. Being underestimated does not mean being small. Sometimes your life is still powerful long before anyone else has the courage to admit it. So tell me in the comments, have you ever had to reclaim a part of yourself that your family ignored or misunderstood? If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember their own name again.